So finally, for our speaker tonight, we have Cormac Quinn. Sorry about that. He's a senior environmental studies major at St. John's University. He lives in Eco House, which is a special living community arrangement. He's a board member of the Climate Action Club, and he serves as a St. John's Sustainability Fellow. He has conducted research on recycling knowledge on campus, effective ways to communicate climate change information, and attitudes towards composting. He created the Flinttown Compost Service that caters to over 250 students and 3 organizations on campus, such as Sexton and Collegeville Institute. So I would like you to please welcome Cormac.
Well, thank you all for coming out here, and a big thank you for Peggy for inviting me out here to talk to you all. I have had research in multiple different areas, but today I wanted to focus on what I did when I went to the COP. Now, next week, you will hear more students that also went to the COP, so I'll try not to talk too much about the UN's processes and how that all turned out, and focus more on what my paper was about. My paper mostly focused on how all of these countries are deciding to reduce their emissions, but none of them are addressing a glaring problem, which, as you can imagine by the title of my speech, is beef.
Okay, so what is COP?
COP, yes. So, in 1992, the United Nations established the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, called the UNFCCC. And when this framework gets together for a meeting, it's called the Conference of the Parties, or the COP. There have been 24 of them, the most recent in December in Poland. And as you can tell, we've had 24 of them, and we're not done with climate change yet, so it's an ongoing process. The most notable achievement of the UNFCCC has been the Paris Agreement. They decided to limit warming globally to 2 degrees. That was reached in 2016, and the world hailed it as the coming of the new era. But unfortunately, a recent IPCC report has shown that we're not on track to hit that. We're still on track to get much warmer than 2 degrees. So when I went to the COP, number 24, with a group of students, a lot of the discussions were about how to fund these mitigation processes. How can we fund these countries to make sure that they're not emitting so that we can keep global temperatures limited? There's these big conference rooms full of all these people in suits, and they're all talking about business interests. The only NGOs, non-governmental organizations that were advocating for non-business solutions were pushed to the side rooms where they didn't get the big stages, they didn't get the big publicity. Those are left for the delegates from the countries. Next one. So 2 months before the COP conference, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of something about scientists. A bunch of scientists from around the world came together and they said, hey guys, we have 12 years to curb our emissions, otherwise they're going to get rampantly out of control and we'll have no chance of stopping it. Now, if you're like my mom, you heard that and you said, oh, we got 12 years and then we're done? Cool. That's not how it goes. We have 12 years to pull it back, but we'll still live past 12 years. But you can see there was an imperative created at this COP specifically to say, all right, guys, there's a clock that we've now put on this planet and it's ticking. So when we went to the conference, there was all these displays of these innovative technologies. Let me show you a way to make your buses not emit carbon dioxide. They had these big plans to build solar fields the size of states. And my favorite was the driverless cars. This was their solution. If everyone's driving electric cars, then we're good. So you can see that there's a lot of flaws in this. The megaforests they want to sequester all the carbon into. There's a lot of flaws in these plans. Who's going to be planting these trees? Where are these trees going to go? What happens to the trees after they're grown? There's all these ideas that they had going around there, really ambitious plans, but a lot of them were just not as feasible as they could have been. Now, a lot of the focus on the carbon dioxide makes sense. Carbon dioxide is it lasts about 100 years in the atmosphere, and it has a lot of warming potential from the radiant energy from the sun being reflected back in, called the greenhouse effect. Now, it makes sense that we target this because we make an awful lot of it. But unfortunately, because the conversation is so focused on carbon dioxide, we miss some of the easier targets that we really could be going for, because the UN is chosen to fight carbon dioxide. Any action you take on carbon dioxide will take 100 years to feel. That's not going to be great for people who are only living 100 years. There's no incentive for them, and as humans, it's a little hard for us to grapple with that. Now, methane, and especially animal agriculture in general, there's a lot of emissions associated with this, and it's the same idea of the stuff you buy. Your shirts, your shoes, your car, these all have emissions related to them in the production process that we don't necessarily see, but we suffer the consequences for it. And it's not necessarily our fault. We need to eat and drive and be clothed. But this is an area that I think we can make a lot of difference in, because it does contribute a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. When you compare it against transportation, this includes all the cars, all the planes, all the boats across the world. Animal agriculture is still emitting more than all of that combined. Now, it's coming in different ways. Like I was saying, carbon dioxide is the focus, and cars create a lot of carbon dioxide, so it's very easy to target them. But it's a lot harder to target cows. So methane is a greenhouse gas that has 25 to 100 times more warming potential than carbon dioxide, while only being in the atmosphere for about 10 to 20 years. So what that means is it's bad in the short run, but it's only there for the short run. And that's why it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, because if you were to say to someone, oh, all these emissions, they'll be gone in 20 years that are causing the problem, they're not going to be so concerned than the 100-year lifespan of carbon dioxide. But the main problem is in how powerful it is. Now, the methane is mostly comes from cows. Cows and fracking have about the same amount of methane emissions in the US, and the two serve very different purposes. We need to keep the lights on, whereas we don't always need to eat a burger. So again, there's that moment where you have to think about, we have these emissions, we have these, they call them carbon budgets, that we can spend until we don't have any more chance to spend them and the world is done. So we really got to start being critical about how we're spending our carbon budgets, because we can't stop emitting, but we can choose where it goes. There it is. 25 to 100 times more powerful in the short term, though. So this is, part of my paper was about why the UN wouldn't target methane. Because we've had 24 COPs now, and we haven't seen a whole lot of progress. There's been global outrage at the fact that all these guys in suits are getting together in these exquisite halls to talk about not doing anything. Whereas if methane emissions were targeted, we'd see a reaction within 20 years. Now that 12-year window that I told you about, that can be widened. That's just talking about how much time we have for carbon dioxide. But if we were to reduce our methane emissions, that window of opportunity to get wider, and we'd have that opportunity to have a 25th and 26th and 27th COP to discuss all the fancy technologies they can do. Now, there's been a lot in the news a lot recently, especially with the new Green Deal on the media's mind. People are saying, they're coming to take away my burgers. Now, I'm not going to say I'm going to take away your burgers, but I will ask you to stop eating them, and I think you'll understand by the end of it why that's such a good idea. Now, meat is very integral to a lot of cultures. Fish and chips is a great example of a classic British meal. Hamburger, hot dogs are typical American foods that we'll eat on 4th of July. And that's why it's so difficult for people to combat these problems. I was talking to the Minister of the Environment for Uganda, Charles Pierre, and he was telling me that the governments don't want to tell people not to eat meat because that infringes on their daily lives. And the government's role is to preserve the homeostasis of the citizen. And so they'll take any other option. They'll go to great lengths to create technologies to reduce their energy production's emissions. So that way the average citizen never has to know anything. They want business to keep running because business is how the governments will stay afloat. So there's a bit of a problem here at the COP being nations that are businesses in a more direct sense, and the fact that the change is just not happening. Now, meat consumption has been on the rise for decades and is only going to increase. As more developing nations will reach the middle class, meat is a sign of affluence, and so more people are going to want to be eating meat. China did not eat a lot of meat 50 years ago, but now I'm pretty sure they eat more beef than we do. So it's a growing problem. That's why we haven't necessarily talked about it in the last 50 years. But now that the 12-year window is closing on us, it becomes a bit more of an imperative. Here it is again. It is only expected to rise, and while beef is not the largest share of it, it does have the largest share of the emissions compared to all the rest of kinds of meat except for lamb. Now, a lot of the meat production is focused in a lot of the developed nations as well. So a lot of these companies are already in affluent nations, and they're only getting richer. And another problem is that a lot of the power of these meat industries are focused into the hands of very few people. There's about 75% of the beef in the US comes from 4 different companies that are processing it. At least when you're looking at antitrust laws and the SEC, you should be thinking, we need to make sure that this is more divided up. A lot of the arguments at the COP was that if we just incentivize more smallholder farming, that the problem would be solved. It's not necessarily the case, but again, distributing that economic prosperity would be a step in the right direction to helping global carbon emissions. Now, this is what I was talking about, that carbon budget. Right now, it's at 51 gigatons. That's just what we're putting out. According to the Paris Agreement, this downwards line right there is what we should be doing in order to not have the world end in a cataclysmic event. If meat consumption projections are expected to rise as they will, 81% of that budget that we have, of carbon that we can spend, will be on meat and dairy products. That doesn't leave a whole lot of leeway for things like when you're creating this new infrastructure for the future and you want all these solar panels, you need a lot of carbon to put those solar panels in there. And then when you get to the end result, you're still not going to be carbon free. You're still going to need to produce items because people still need to be living. And so 81% of the budget seems like an unfair amount for something that isn't a necessity at this point. Now, when you combine the top 5 meat and dairy companies, you'll find that they will emit more than the top 3 oil and gas companies individually. Not quite that phenomenal. But it's still a lot when you think about how we target the oil and gas companies, and then we don't ever really think about the meat industries as being one of the more emitting of the planet. When you look at the top 20, you'll find that they emit more than many nations. I mean, these are industrialized nations, and they're emitting less than the top 20. And the top 20 may be a large share of the world's meat and dairy products, but the fact that it takes up more than Germany, I find to be a bit disconcerting. Now, one of the big problems with the meat industry is that they're left to self-regulate. The reason that no one's talking, it's sort of a chicken and egg. No one's talking about the meat industry so they can take care of themselves, but because they're taking care of themselves, no one knows what they're doing and can't talk about them. And so 16 of the largest corporations have no emissions reporting whatsoever, whereas the other 2, when they talk about scopes, refer to the different degrees of processes that they involve in their emissions reports. This is where it gets a little more complicated, because when you're talking about meat and dairy, you'll find that 45% of their emissions will come from the production of the grain or the soybean, the transportation of it, the processing of the meat, and the transportation of it again to the store. Meat industries will say, well, that isn't us. We just grow the cow. So they'll also avoid reporting emissions on those grounds. So it makes it very difficult to try to understand how much emissions are coming from these companies. Now, in the US, we spend about $38 billion on subsidies. We only get $11.3 million for fruit and vegetables compared to the $38 billion for meat and dairy. Now, when you combine this with the low estimates of 28 to 61 billion that we spend on healthcare that's related to meat health issues, you combine these together, you'll get 66 billion on the low end of subsidies and then externalized costs that we are paying through healthcare, through air quality management. And that dwarfs 66 billion compared to the 11.6 billion we spend on climate change research and resilience. You can see that we spend a lot more of our money thinking about what we're going to eat than thinking about how we're going to live until tomorrow. Now, when I talk about externalized costs, that's referring to prices associated with the emissions. So when we talk about pricing carbon, they do actually ascribe a certain amount of money. They say this much carbon is worth this much money. And when you start to quantify it all, $414 billion, that's not being paid. It's just not being paid by the meat industry. It's being paid by you and me. The tax dollars that we spend to subsidize the industry, to clean up the waterways after they pollute them, after the air quality, and the health-related issues that involved in meat, it's still being paid, but just not by them. Now, when you look at how much emissions we're putting out, I'm not going to ask you to stop heating your home, because I like you and I don't want you to. But when we start thinking about these other three, transportation, stuff you buy, and food. Transportation, we were having a discussion earlier at the other table about how the urban sprawl in the US is a big problem. You essentially need a car to get most places. As a student at St. John's, I know that not having a car means I usually don't leave campus for the semester that I'm here. And then there's a lot of focus put on the other two. Transportation is always in the crosshairs of the environmentalists who are saying we need to get rid of the emissions from cars. But again, as we said earlier, the meat emissions are far outstripping the transportation. As far as stuff you buy, I'll always incentivize you not to buy more stuff. I think there was Tim Oswald was talking about waste last week. Yeah, so I hope you're all trying to reduce how much stuff you're buying there, because it is phenomenal. I was telling the other table, St. John's spends $250,000 a semester on removing waste from campus. Removing stuff. It's simply ridiculous at a certain point. And when we think about how much of our emissions come from food, we also have to think that we are Americans, and we're known in the world for eating a lot of meat. And it's not necessarily our fault. You know, as we said before, it's a cultural thing. You know, on the 4th of July, you're eating burgers and hot dogs. We are an affluent nation, so we will be eating foods that aren't that are necessarily affluent. But 209 pounds, that seems to be a bit much. And so, as I said earlier, I will ask you to stop eating as much beef, maybe not all of it, but we can scale back a little, because this is getting a little out of control. Not all meat is the same. When we start thinking about what kinds of meats we are eating, there are large differences. You know, when I became a vegetarian, it was not because I have a lot of love for cows. I mean, I do like them, but I don't really mind that they're killed for meat. But I feel a lot better about eating chicken as opposed to beef. And that's one of the things I want us all to think about is, you don't necessarily need to be a vegetarian because you like cows or you think that the world should all be peace and love. It's fine to be a vegetarian because of the ecological impacts. I get a lot of people will question me about that at school. They'll say, well, where are your morals? You're not doing it because you like the cows? I said, no, I did it because I'm an environmentalist. And I think a lot of us identify as environmentalists, at least to a certain degree, but are missing this huge point. I don't want to take away your meat, and I won't. I have no way to. But as far as what we eat, we can make a choice. So avoiding these red meats, we already are told to do that all the time for the health reasons that are associated with it, contamination issues. Moving to more of a poultry diet is already a step in the right direction. So when we're talking about taking away hamburgers, let's not take away hamburgers, let's just introduce turkey burgers. So I hope that all of you have taken the time to replace all the incandescent light bulbs in your house with LEDs and to take shorter showers. But that's not the biggest thing you can do. And I think you would all want to do the most you could do with the least amount of work possible. At least as a college student, that's always what I'm trying to do. And this is the way to do it. Our diets are essentially tied to that stuff that we buy that you talked about last week, all those emissions tied in, except that while I'll buy a shirt once every few months, I'm eating every day. And so we have to think about those emissions not only as I do buy stuff, but I eat 3 times a day. Those emissions are going to triple. So a third of the world's land is dedicated to creating the crops and to house the animals that we eat. This is because upwards of 80% of the world's corn is sent to animals to feed them. And I think 50% of all the soy is sent to animals to feed them. This takes a lot of space to grow all those crops to feed the animals, and the animals also themselves need space so that they can roam around a bit. And if you've seen pictures of feedlots, I mean, they are extensive bits of work. And so this 1/3 of the Earth's land, we could think of better purposes for this. People who wanted those megaforests that we talked about earlier, got some space for you. Solar panel initiatives, got some space for you. Part of the problem with meat is that it takes up a lot of space. And part of the problem with all that space is that then we don't get the chance for plants to grow there that could feed us. Because photosynthesis is not that effective. It's not breaking 3%, converting the sun's energy into plant matter. So everything on Earth is powered by the sun, to an extent. All life is based on the energy that we receive. And then 2.2% of that, at best, is turned into possible food. And then we feed it to cows. So what happens is we create these calories from the plants and we feed it to the cows and the chickens, and their conversion ratios of the calories they take in to the protein they can give out aren't great. So we're already taking the 100% from the sun to the 2% that we get from plants, and then we're processing that through the cows and the chickens and the pigs to create the meat. So we're losing a lot of solar efficiency here that really could be utilized to create crops to feed people in the U.S. If all the land dedicated to grazing and creating crops for cattle and chicken were dedicated to growing food for people, we could feed 40% of the U.S. simply off of that, not including the food that we already create to feed ourselves. So there's an efficiency problem involved here. And I'm not a scientist, but I do appreciate efficiency. So here's that idea. So if you have 1.5 acres, you take all that, you can create some plant matter, and you take that plant matter and you can feed it to the cow, and you can create the 375 pounds of beef. Or if you don't take it through that extra step and you don't lose all that efficiency, you can get 37,000 pounds. Now, it may not be the same nutrition, obviously, but you can remedy that in other ways. At the very least, there's an efficiency problem involved in our production of meat. Now, the Amazon may be a far way away, but it is called the lungs of the world, and it's definitely important. Most of the terrestrial biodiversity in the entire world is found inside the Amazon rainforest. It has more trees per square kilometer than any other place on Earth. It's a fantastic place. I've been there. Unfortunately, most of the destruction that's happening, it's about an acre a minute, I think is the rate at which the Amazon is being torn down. 80% of it is so that they can create crops to feed the cows, or they can create pasture land to feed the cows. I'll follow this up with desertification. It's a fancy term for things turning into desert. I know you couldn't guess that from the name. And the Amazon is especially susceptible to this because the soil in the Amazon doesn't hold on to nutrients because it's in a rainforest. It's meant to be on a constant cycle of up and down, up and down. That's why there's so much life there. The reason it's a little less life here is because the nutrients can be taken down into the soil and left to sit for a little while and create bigger trees. So when we take away this Amazon forest and we put in this pasture, the cows will eat on it, but the ground doesn't hold nutrients, so it all slips away very quickly. And so the pasture that they created will very quickly disappear. They need to create another one, and the land that they leave behind is completely irreparable. There's nothing you can really do once the soil starts to dissipate and turn into sand and lose all of its nutrients. So this problem compounds itself time and time again, every single day, 1 acre at a minute, 1 acre per minute. Yeah. Now, I did hope that you all put in high efficiency shower heads and take short showers. But again, we're an individual person, and most of our water consumption is such a small amount compared to the municipal system that we are involved in. So any effect that we have has to be gauged by this ratio, that we only account for 5% of the water use, whereas 55% is for animal agriculture. So any effect you have in reducing your meat consumption will have a larger effect on preserving water than taking shorter showers because of that ratio, because it takes so much more water to create the beef. I think it's about 2,500 gallons of water per 1 pound of beef, I think is the ratio. Maybe it comes up later. Who knows? Yeah, all right. So this is some typical water amounts that are necessary to create some of our most favorite things. And as you can see, the burger does take a lot of water. And we were having this discussion earlier again. You guys are all way ahead of me on the discussion about water consumption and about how the water is always, it's in this hydrological cycle. The same water that's been here will always be here. As my professor likes to say, you're all drinking dinosaur piss. And he's not wrong. It's all in that contained system. And that's where part of the problem becomes, because if we're extracting all this water to create this beef, we're contaminating it with the ungodly amounts of manure that these cows are creating, with the pesticides and herbicides that are getting washed out along with the plants that are being created for the beef. There's a lot of water contamination that becomes a lot harder to change once it's contaminated and enters the bigger picture, the ocean. You can't track it down as easy. So stemming this problem right at the bud is very important, because watersheds are always cycling downwards, and they'll always reach the ocean. And so everything, all the nitrogen involved with our fertilizers will end up in those watersheds and will create these dead zones where there is no life in the water, no fish, no bacteria, no nothing, because they create this eutrophication effect, which I think comes later. Let's hope. So again, take shorter showers, but also we're such a small part of the picture. When you think about it, we're pretty small compared to a cow. We don't need as much water. I think they drink about 40 gallons of water a day and go through 50 pounds of grain each day. At least a dairy cow does. Yeah. Yes, this is a good one. Cows poop. That's just a fact of life. But they poop a lot more than we do. And so all this waste, when you start to visualize it, if you take all the cow's waste from all over the world and you were to lay it flat, you could cover every major city in the entire world. And I'm talking about New York, Austin, Tokyo, Beijing. All of these cities would be completely covered in manure if we were to spread it out. But the problem is that we don't spread it out. We keep it in these containment ponds, which I imagine is a lot of in this area, because this is a big beef area, so please don't hurt me for this presentation. We create these waste ponds, and they're just ticking time bombs waiting to explode and go into the major waterways and contaminate them with all of the bacteria that are involved in the cow's manure. Other than that, what are you going to do with if you're not going to put it in a containment pond, what are you going to do? You're going to make methane from it? Sure, that's another greenhouse gas that hopefully they'll use. Otherwise, just washes down the river, enters the mainstream, enters our oceans, creates dead zones, eutrophication. So, this is where it was meant to be earlier. So, when these fertilizers are running off to create the crops for the cows, they'll enter the waterways. They'll create an algae bloom, so all these bacteria are happy, but that kills everything underneath it because it just blocks out the sun completely, all this green algae. And then once the algae dissipates, there's no fish. So then, because there's no fish, the algae dies, and this dead zone is created where there simply is just no life in that area of water. So not only is our beef consumption hurting our hearts because of all the diseases associated with it, it's also killing our fish. So we're losing twice on this one. Yes, 500 nitrogen-flooded dead zones. A lot of them are contained within the U.S., especially along the Mississippi River, which I grew up within half hour walk from, and these aren't necessarily things you can contain once they're in the waterways. Again, I want to stress that once things enter the waterways, extremely difficult to get them out. So stemming that problem immediately by reducing the fertilizers that are associated with the crops, by reducing the manure associated with the cow, that we need to do it there because we can't do it afterwards. Now, you may be saying, okay, I've been told to not eat meat all my life. People are always saying vegetarianism is a good idea. Love the cows. Not everyone is so welcoming to the message. Worldwide, activists are killed every year because they speak out against these large corporations for what they're doing to the Amazon, especially in Brazil, but all across the world. The meat industry is one of the most powerful in the entire world. More than oil and gas, only because people are always going to need to eat. While Natalie Bennett, she was the former leader of the Green Party of Wales and England. I talked to her at the COP, and she was saying that the reason we're having so much solar panel development and energy production development is because people are scared that the oil and gas will be gone soon. So they're already making steps to create that energy when we're not allowed to burn the coal anymore. The same doesn't necessarily apply here, because while you can tell people to eat less meat, unless you stop them, these meat and dairy industries will still be receiving all the funds they need to lobby the legislators that are creating these laws, which is why no one's checking in on their greenhouse gas emissions. They're incredibly powerful. Now, in 2016, we said, all right, Paris Agreement, we did it. We're going to solve the problems. But they really didn't specify anything at all. And so I'd like to propose to the UN a solution. It's zero cost as well. Reduce the meat consumption. Now, there's a lot of ecological benefits that are tied in to reducing your meat consumption. Like I said before, water usage. You clean up your waterways so that they're not, one, dying, or two, full of manure that we're not able to drink or have to filter out before we can do anything with. The land necessary for growing all of the crops can be opened up for solar fields. The air quality that doesn't have as much methane in it won't be much of a problem for people, the ranchers who are out there working in these giant feedlots. There's untold benefits that are that can come with reducing your meat consumption, whereas if we're to switch the whole electrical grid to solar, that takes so much money, so many people, so much land, so much time, whereas this is zero cost. This is zero effort from any of us other than finding a new cookbook. It makes sense to me. And if you do want to learn more, I'd recommend two things. So Cowspiracy was a movie that came out back in the 2000s. It's a little conspiracy theorist, so take it with a grain of salt. But it does present a lot of really good facts about the meat industry. He seems to think that they're out to get him. You can just avoid that part. The other part is Emissions Impossible. This is more of a scientific report, but it is made to be more friendly for people to read. It's created by the International Agricultural IATP. It'll come to me later. I'm sorry. So really, all I'd really ask you to do is, I don't want to take away your burgers, but the next time you think about eating one, consider this. You have a carbon budget. I mean, we as a nation have a carbon budget that legislators keep shrinking because they want to achieve these goals and to not have climate change irreparably destroy our world. But each one of us essentially has a carbon budget in that carbon budget. And we can choose whether we want to buy the beef or the chicken. Or, I know this is a crazy thought, you could just not have the meat at all. If you're a poor college student like me, you never really ended up buying meat in the first place. A little too expensive. And it's not impossible to make tasty meals. I have my roommates come home often and say, oh, this smells good. What is it? And I go, eggs and potatoes. It's all about spices. And so one thing I think that could be really beneficial, both as a community here and to help all of you achieve these goals, would be to create a parish cookbook, but only for vegetarian dishes. I've given this talk at my mother's women's group, and a lot of them started speaking up at the end, and they went, oh, I have a great vegetarian recipe for curry. Oh, I have a great vegetarian recipe for this and that. And they ended up making a cookbook to share within each other about recipes that are just vegetarian, but maybe they're a family recipe that no one really knows about. I think that would really be beneficial for all. I can help facilitate it. I don't think I can help too much. As you can see, I don't cook. But other than that, I'd really just, next time you're having a burger, think twice. Thanks. I think I take questions now, don't I? Yeah. Sure. All right. Unless I spelled it out perfectly for all of you.
Cormac, is there any downside to substituting veggie burgers for burgers?
So there are certain problems associated with soy that I've heard of, such as it can have some effects on female reproductive success. But other than that, Natalie Bennett, again, that former leader of the Green Party of Wales and England, she made a point of saying, when we're switching to this vegetarian diet, we can't just have all the corn from cows be feeding us, because that's not going to be great for our nutrition. We need to have a diversity of plants associated with our vegetarian diet. So veggie burgers, good move, but also not just replacing the meat, but adding in a new vegetable is very important in order just to keep you healthy. I like you, Peggy. I want to keep you upright, you know? Yes.
What drove the meat consumption up so much? Is it the cost was being driven down artificially, or was it advertising was convincing us that that was a good lifestyle to eat more meat?
Both. So you have that cultural aspect of burgers and hot dogs. I can't necessarily trace that back to a specific moment or person who said, this is America. But there is that problem where meat has become such an integral part of our meals. Someone once said, meat should be a condiment and not the main course. And I liked that, where meat consumption shouldn't be the sole purpose of the meal, more of a side addition to it. And it also is efficiencies. So all these businesses saw the rising meat consumption and began pumping out chicken and beef to flood the market and to drop the value. And then once people started buying into it, the meat industries had to be subsidized in order to keep that level of production going. And so it was an issue of the American people were told this is the right way to go, and then the meat industry matched it, and then the American people became subjected to the rule of the meat and dairy industry to say, all right, this is how you eat now. I've seen people who have only a plate of chicken nuggets at the Reef, and I become very concerned for their health. So it's that problem of meat shouldn't be the sole move. It should be like a condiment to it. I like that a lot. So not taking away your meat, just don't make it the main course, which is a problem. Celebration times, you want a lamb roast like my mom does, and you have to start thinking about where these can change. What do you do instead of a lamb roast? If you find out, let me know. My mom's looking for suggestions. I'm mad.
No, the lamb roast is probably better than a beef roast.
No. Lamb is the worst as far as carbon emissions goes.
Really?
Yeah. As far as the hierarchy goes, it's lamb, beef, cheese, pork, something, chicken, turkey. So poultry is about a third, if not half, of the emissions associated with red meats. And so if not only for your own health, thinking about the global carbon budget and thinking about environmentalism in general, going with those white meat options is going to be a better idea. Any other questions? Yeah.
Have you heard Jim Gaffigan? He's got a quote. He said, I usually don't have a burger, a brat, and a steak, but it's the 4th of July, and I need the energy if I'm going to start blowing stuff up.
A great example of, that is a cultural part of us. It's interesting, McDonald's, their burgers, they don't actually come with flavor. The flavor's added to them. There's chemists who are solely dedicated to flavor. They're called flavorologists. I read about it in a book once. I hope it's true. And these people create the tastes that are associated with the burger, and it's implanted on them. These same flavorologists are now working for vegetarian-based burger companies. So things like Impossible Burger are made to have beet juice blood that seems like blood, and then all the same taste as a burger. So it's really not impossible for you to get that burger, but not have it be beef, if you're really dedicated to the burger. I know I am.
So if you took the beef that we're going to eat out of the equation of dairy, cows, and beef to eat, what would be the ratio there?
Of how many cows, or the emissions associated with them?
Because you said cheese is way up there as far as emissions. But you got to have some dairy to make cheese.
Yeah.
So if we cut out all the eating beef cows, we would be reducing.
Tremendously. There's about 70 billion animals reared not just cows, but 70 billion animals reared to be slaughtered every year. So there'd be a significant portion of that for sure. I don't have exact numbers, but I'd like to look into it now.
It'd be interesting, because dairy's big.
Yeah. Very big.
What are your plans after graduation?
Well, I'll be working in Alaska for a research organization looking into the effects of climate change, and that'll be until August, and then I'll be on the West Coast, so I imagine I'll figure something out.
Good for you.
Thank you. Is everyone pumped?
I need you.
Go get some spices. You know, that's my solution to it all. If someone wants to volunteer to be the book creator, you're not
So
volunteering.
Is this connected to the style of farming? For example, large feedlots versus a small decentralized agriculture. So in central Minnesota here, we have the St. Joe Meat Market, which, we have smaller operations. Do these statistics run across all operations, or do they skew one way or the other?
Yeah, so when you're looking at grass-fed beef, problems arise when you look at the amount of land necessary to raise them on, and then you add in the extra 6 months necessary to rear a cattle to the proper size for slaughter on grass instead of corn. As far as smallholder versus industrial farms goes, interestingly, industrial farms are actually more efficient at it. There's a study brought up that was pointing out that the emissions related to producing chicken had reduced by about a third since the amount of emissions necessary to create one chicken had reduced by a third over a 40-year period because of technology advances and changes within the chicken. And what the problem was is that the chicken-related emissions had gone 5 times higher than when the study had started because we were producing so much more. So yes, these large factory farms do create a more efficient beef. They're creating at such a scale that it negates any sort of benefits that could be associated with it. There are certain areas, like New Zealand is more apt for rearing cattle, and so it doesn't have the same impact as someone in China who is trying to rear cattle. So there are certain discrepancies that are involved, but when you're considering these, I would go back to the idea of photosynthesis and the 2% efficiency. We're losing a lot of that efficiency no matter what if we're putting it through an animal. I'm not a math major, but I know that that's just not good math. Well, thank you all for listening.
Thank you.